Project risk identification. This nugget is the first of a series of 3 nuggets on risk management. In this nugget, we'll examine the issues related to project risk identification. Before we get into that, we need to have a definition of what are risks. Risks are events. Risks are components to your project that involve uncertainty. There is a degree of uncertainty as to whether a specific project task will be able to be completed within the planned time or within the planned budget. Risks involve a degree of unplanned. You believe you have identified all of the tasks that are appropriate to complete your project, but there is always the risk that there may be additional activities, additional tasks that are required to complete your project. Risks are traditionally thought of in the negative sense. Risks are components that are going to affect your project negatively, take more time or take more money to complete. There is also a probability that risks can have a positive impact on your project, that a positive risk will be able to reduce the amount of time your project takes to complete, or will be able to reduce the amount of money required to complete your project. These positive risks are often better called opportunities. So it's your job as a project manager to identify all of the risks, the positive opportunities, as well as the negative risks, which are any event on your project that involves uncertainty or any unplanned events on your project that's going to impact the overall outcome of your project. Why do we want to do risk management if there's uncertainty, if they're unplanned? Why do we need to do risk management? We need to do risk management because the goal is to make change. We want to change the probability that the risk event is going to happen. We want to change the probability of risks downward, that it's less probable that the risk is going to happen. We want to change the probability of opportunity upwards to ensure that the opportunity happens and that your project is positively impacted. On the same vein, we want to change the impact. It may actually not always be possible to change the probability of a risk event, so therefore we may want to focus on changing the impact. If we can't change the probability, but we can change the impact, instead of having a 10-day negative impact on our project, we can reduce that to a 5-day negative impact, or conversely, instead of having only a 5-day opportunity for our project and increase that to a 10-day improvement on our project. We absolutely want to effect the powers that we have as a project manager to put risk management in place, to change the probability, to change the impact, to deal with risks. Risk management is all about dealing in the unknown. Dealing in the unknown can be very stressful. How can we talk about producing plans? How can we talk about managing the unknown when in fact it is unknown? Risk management is very challenging. Risk management is very difficult, but risk management is very critical to successful project delivery. In this nugget and the next 2 nuggets, we'll provide to you a series of techniques that you can apply to ensure you are doing effective risk management for your project. As we do in each of our nuggets, we will examine the components of the PMP guide that relate specifically to project risk identification. In this case, the 2 components of risk management from the PMP guide that we're going to be dealing with in this nugget are risk management planning. Risk management planning is developing the strategy that you're going to use on your project to deal with risks. It has nothing to do with identifying specific risks and dealing with individual risks. Risk management planning is developing the overall strategy that you are going to put in place for your project to ensure that you are effectively managing all risks. It identifies the degree of risk aversion that your project is going to have. It identifies your strategy for managing risks. It's putting together the overall plan that you and your project team are going to follow for risk management throughout the project delivery cycle. And then we will discuss risk identification. How do you go about finding risks? How do you identify risks? If risks are unknowns, if risks are uncertainty, if risks involve unplanned tasks, how do you ever identify them? How do you deal in the unknown? We'll deal specifically in this nugget with some strategies that you can apply to properly identify risks and to ensure that you're dealing with the right risks as you're putting together your risk management strategies. The first step in project risk management is development of a project risk management plan. Basically, the identification of the strategies and processes that you will be following to manage risks throughout the project delivery lifecycle. The first step in developing the risk management plan is to conduct a stakeholder analysis to understand the stakeholders' attitudes towards risk. Are they risk seekers or are they risk avoiders? And I am talking about risk seekers or avoidance. I'm not talking about individual preferences, whether a specific stakeholder would rather stay at home and play chess, or whether that stakeholder would rather go out and participate in an extreme sport such as rock climbing or skydiving. I'm talking about the overall risk attitude for the project. Is this project a risk-seeking project, or is this project a risk avoidance project? Your first reaction to that may be, no project in a business environment should be risk-seeking. Businesses are not about taking risks. Businesses are about ensuring the continuity and stability of the organization. While that is true, there will be instances where project-based risks or projects will want to take on risks to ensure the project achieves the overall organizational strategy. If the project is initiated to develop a new product, or the project is initiated to develop a breakthrough approach, allowing the organization to deliver a new product, new service, or differentiate their product or service, that project should be a risk-seeking project. That project should be willing to take risks to develop that breakthrough strategy. At the end of the project, if the risks are too much and the project fails, it was a learning experience. The business still continues with the status quo, and they will simply start a new project with a new set of risks, with a new strategy to develop the next breakthrough strategy. Other projects where they're make or break situations, if this project fails, the business will be in trouble, absolutely need to be risk avoidance projects. You need to ensure there's sufficient structure in place in your project. You need to ensure there's sufficient contingency and processes in your place to mitigate and eliminate project risks before they're encountered to ensure that your project does successfully complete. You need to understand the overall corporate factors. Is your overall corporation a risk-seeking corporation, or is your organization a risk avoidance organization? If you're trying to develop a risk-seeking project for a risk avoidance organization, you're going to encounter significant organizational strife in your delivery process. You need to take that into account and ensure that where possible, your project's risk strategy is consistent with the overall organizational risk strategy. One of the best sources you have for determining the strategy for risk is overall history. How well has your organization fared when dealing with risky projects? How well has your organization dealt with the risks associated with project? How well has your organization dealt with risks that have sufficient contingency and allowances built in to mitigate and eliminate risks? Have they achieved organizational goals, or have they been contrary to organizational goals? You need to factor all of that in to determine your overall project's risk profile. Once you determine the risk profile, is your project going to be a risk-seeking project, i.e. willing to take risks to achieve goals, or is your project going to be risk avoidance? You can then build the appropriate processes. You can build the appropriate time. You can build the appropriate financial allocations, the appropriate dollars into your overall project plan to ensure that you're treating risks consistent with how the project wishes risks to be treated, risk-seeking, deal with risks as they come up, or risk avoidance, ensuring that strategies are in place to mitigate and eliminate all risks before they're encountered in a project delivery situation. Once you've developed the risk profile for the project, the next step is to put together the processes that you're going to use to manage risks throughout your project. The first step in managing risks is to do a proper categorization of the risks. This grid is a very effective system that I've found to help you categorize and analyze the risks. With the grid, I've simply developed a categorization across this axis here where I'm categorizing the probability impact of the risk ranging from low through to very high, and I've assigned numerical values where a low is assigned a value of 1, a medium is a 3, a high is a 7, and a very high is a 9. And then I've defined the evaluation criteria that I'm going to evaluate the risks against. So cost, I've assigned a value of 2. Time, I've assigned a value of 3. Scope is the most important consideration for my stakeholder, assigned a value of 5. And quality is a value of 2. You would get these values from your stakeholder analysis, understanding where the stakeholder's pain points are going to be. Is it more important to the stakeholder that the project is on time, on cost, or to given specifications? And we can see from the determination of scope being a 5 that the 2 specifications is the most critical criteria for our stakeholder, time being the second most critical, and cost being where we have the most flexibility. Then I've determined these simple parameters to help me rank my risks. So if we look at the medium column, for example, we're seeing if the cost impact of this risk is less than 5%, we will rank it a medium. If the time impact is less than 10 days, also ranked a medium. If we're saying there is no significant scope impact, no significant impact is related to scope, it's going to be a medium. And if we have no anticipated problems related to quality, it's going to be a medium. And as you can see by the example that I filled in already, if you put a 1 in the column, so the time impact is less than 10 days, we put a 1 in that column, it's going to do the math and give us a value of 9 as the risk impact based on the time axis. And the 9 is simply the multiplication of the weight for medium of 3 times the weight for 9 is 3. You would complete this for each of the other 3 criteria, and you would come up with a resulting ranking for the risk, where the ranking is determined by low if the sum is less than 50, medium if it's greater than 50 and less than 75, or high if it's greater than 75. Now each of these numbers, the ranking of low, medium, high, the evaluation of the weights for cost, time, scope, quality, and the rankings for the impact probability will be determined by you as part of your stakeholder analysis. The key is developing a consistent methodology that you're going to use to apply and thoroughly analyze each of the risk situations to ensure its relevance, to ensure its impact, to validate how the project needs to deal with the risk. We'll be coming back to this grid later in the nugget, and we will be completing it based on some actual risk scenarios that we'll be identifying. With the stakeholder analysis complete and the completion of our risk probability impact assessment matrix, it's time to actually document our risk management process. We do that through the development of the risk management plan. The risk management plan is simply a comprehensive document that consolidates all of the information related to how you're going to manage risks on your project. Here, if we look at a sample table of contents for our risk management plan, we have the executive summary, the risk management approach. The risk management approach is going to be the consolidation of the stakeholder analysis, your strategy for dealing with risks, whether this project is going to be risk adverse, whether this project is risk seeking, and actively defines how you're going to manage risks on the project. The next step towards that is defining the roles and responsibility. Who is directly responsible for risk management in the project? What role will the project manager play? What role will the team play? What role will the other stakeholders and the project sponsor play? You'll define the risk categories. How are you going to categorize risks? Categorize risk by technology, by human resources, by business, specific criteria, specific categories for how you're going to identify and categorize the individual risks that you're going to be tracking on your project. The risk probabilities and impact area essentially is the consolidation of our risk assessment and impact matrix. It's the process you're going to follow to categorize, to document, to understand risks on your project. And finally, a definition of the ongoing risk management process, how the project is going to do ongoing risk management how often, how rigorously is the risk management process going to be applied on your project. With the completion and approval of your project management plan, the last step in project planning is the identification of the risks for your project. Risk identification. As we discussed in the introduction to this nugget, there are two types of risks associated with project. There are the known risks and the unknown risks. So what would I classify as a known risk? A known risk would be a circumstance where you believe there is a possibility that something bad may happen to your project. What would be an example of that? Training could be an example of that. Your project is going to use a new programming language. According to the vendor, you need to take a 5-day training course, and at the completion of the 5-day training course, every programmer on your team will be fully versed in the programming language and be self-sufficient and working at proper speed. So you build that original 5-day training into your project plan. But as a wise project manager, you have this fear that there will still be some learning curve. There will still be some issues with learning the new programming language, even at the end of 5 days. That's the risk. The risk is at the end of 5 days, the team will still not be fully versed in the programming language. So therefore, you need to identify that there's a risk that you may need more training. You may need more time. You may need more dollars to provide more training to the team if at the end of the 5 days, when the team is back on the job site, they still aren't performing according to plan. Other known risks could be technology risk, server capacity. Going into the project, you believe you have sized the server with the appropriate capacity to satisfy the application requirements. But there's not a line of code written. There are no measures against how well the application will actually perform. You believe you have sized the server appropriately, but there's a risk that you may need to build a bigger server. There's a risk that you may need more CPU. There's a risk that you may need more memory. Therefore, you need to build in a contingency of specific dollars to build out the server as required once the application is in place. So training, server capacity are examples of known risks. Known risks are where you have taken the appropriate action to develop the project plan based on the information you believe is appropriate for project delivery. The risks are, based on your experience, there is a possibility, and that's the key to risk management. There is a possibility that additional training may be required, or there is a possibility that additional server capacity may be required. Unknown risks are a very different scenario. Unknown risks are unknown. You can't specifically say there is a training risk or there is a technology risk. Unknown risks is simply an allocation of additional time, additional funds to your project to cover all of the unknowns. So unlike training and server capacity, where you can allocate specific time and specific dollars to specific circumstances, unknowns requires a general contingency. Unknown risk requires a general buffer. So you need to allocate time, maybe 10%. You need to allocate specific dollars, $5,000, to deal with the unknowns associated with project delivery. Unknown risks need to be managed very differently than known risks, and we'll cover that in the next nugget. So now that we're actively involved with risk identification, we need to be aware of sources of risk. And although I provided a list of many sources of risk for your project, the sources of risk for your project are literally unlimited. But key areas to look at: technology risks. As discussed, technology risks can be very real in your project. Server capacity, bandwidth, inappropriate technology. How well have you configured the technology? How well have you identified all of the technology components required to make your project a success? What are the team risks associated with your project? Team risks can be training related, as we discussed. Team risks can be human based. Will your team work together? Does your team know each other? Will they be going through the standard team creation process of storming, norming, forming, and performing? Will you be able to get the team to the performing stage? How well will the team work with you? Will the team like your project management style, or will the team not work well with you? What are the issues related to scope? How well defined is the scope? The better defined the scope, the less risk. The more loosely defined the scope, the more avenue of risk that's going to come out and impact your project. What's the status of the business? Is the business in a growth mode? Is the business in a stable mode? Is the business in a decline mode? Businesses in stages of rapid growth will be directly interested in changing the scope related to the project. Therefore, again, a rapid growth business will often relate to more risk for your project. What's the current state of the economy? When the economy is good, there's typically more money available for projects, therefore less focus, less scrutiny on projects. When the economy is poor, there is absolute focus on projects to do more with less. Therefore, there is more risk to your project, that your project will be challenged. Therefore, you must build that into your project management plan. What's the status of competition? Is your company actively trying to keep up with the competition? Hence, more risk. Is your company leading the competition? Again, more risks. You need to be aware of each and every component of these and what impact the technology, the team, etc. is going to have on the project composition and therefore on the risk elements that it's going to impact your project during delivery mode. As we talked about, there are known risks. So we identified 3 risks associated with technology: server, inappropriate technology, bandwidth. Are there other unknown risks associated with technology? And chances are yes. You do not have time during project planning. You do not have the knowledge during project planning to identify all risks associated with technology. So there's always going to be unknown risks. And again, you need to allocate the time, the dollars to deal with both the known risks and the unknown risks. A key component when you're dealing with risk management is not to confuse the specific allocations you've made for known. You allocated 5 days and $5,000 of specific risk management funding to deal with team training. Do not consume that allocation for unknown risks. If you have specific funding for known risks, deal with it specifically, have additional allocation for the unknown risks. The key in good, successful risk identification is look at all sources of risk and ensure that you're covering all possible areas and providing the additional allocation for unknown risks, because there will be unknown risks that are going to impact your project. While it's wonderful to have a list of risk categories such as technology, human resources, etc., how do you really go about doing a risk identification? Where do you find the risks? How do you find the risks on your project? Suggestions may be brainstorming. Work with your team. Have a whiteboard session where simply saying, team members, where are the risks? How is this project going to be impacted? Do a blue sky session where any and all possibilities are acceptable, and then go through and do further analysis to determine which are realistic risks, which are probable risks, and which can be dismissed. Another very common approach for risk identification is to use the Delphi approach. The Delphi approach is simply going out and finding known experts in the project field. Interviewing these project experts and saying, in your experience, where is this project going to be impacted? In your experience, what risk events are going to happen on this project? What do I need to allocate and plan for when I'm in project delivery? Another very successful approach is to do interviews. Interview the stakeholders, interview the business, interview anyone who has general knowledge or general interest in the project. Ask them where they consider the risk factors to be. Ask them what impacts the project is going to have. Ask them what you need to do to make the project more successful. Often when you're doing interviews, you will get a very high-level definition of project problems. You may need to do a root cause analysis to drill down, to further define, to further analyze the high-level risk scenarios identified during the Delphi technique by the experts, during the interviews with the stakeholders in the business, to do the root cause, to identify truly what are the project problems. Sometimes you need to do a SWOT analysis. Swoop in, do a high-level first cut. Where is this project going to be impacted? What do I need to do to ensure my project is going to be successful? In reality, it all comes down to experience. Experience of yours as a project manager delivering project, experience of the project team, experience of those around you. Where are risks going to happen on this project? What is going to happen that's going to cause this project to suffer delivery challenges? One of my favorite strategies for doing risk identification is to sit in my chair, put my arms behind my head, put my feet up, and do what I call dream and worry. I dream and worry about successful project delivery. I dream and worry about what is going to impact my project, i.e., I do risk identification. Dream and worry is a very important component to effective project management. Project management is not all about managing the numbers. Project management is not all about walking around, taking the pulse of the team, taking the pulse of the stakeholders. Project management is also about dreaming and worrying about what is going well in your project, and dreaming and worrying more specifically about what can impact your project. Doing specific risk identification, putting together the strategies to minimize, to mitigate, to eliminate the risks before they come in and impact successful project delivery. So having completed our risk identification process, we will use one of the risks that we identified earlier, inadequate training. So we go through and do our probability and impact assessment. First, we identify the risk, inadequate. So having identified the risk, we go through and complete our matrix. We analyze the impact of inadequate training is going to have on cost, on time, on scope, and on quality. So in terms of cost, is it going to have an insignificant impact? No. We know we're going to have to do additional training, which means additional costs. Is the cost impact of training going to be medium, i.e. less than 5% of the total project budget? We know how much the additional training is going to be compared to the total project cost, and we determine that yes, in fact, it will be less than 5%, so we put a 1 into that grid. Then we look at time. What impact is inadequate training going to have on total project timelines? Insignificant? Absolutely not. Less than 10 days? Less than 25 days? Greater than 25 days? In this case, the impact is going to be greater than 25 days. We have the additional 5 days training times the number of team members we have on our team, plus the time lost when they went back to their desk before we realized that we had to bring in additional training. So we put a 1 into that grid. We look at the scope impact. What impact is inadequate training going to have on scope? Well, it's simply the delivery aspect of the programming, so it should have very minimal impact on scope, so we will put a 1 into the column for insignificant. And we look at quality. What impact is inadequate training going to have on the quality of the final deliverable? There's certainly going to be an impact related to quality because they're going to be delivering poor code. So is there a potential for problems, or is there going to be definite problems? It's going to be one of the two, and in this case, although the inadequate training is going to result in poorer code, it's probably not going to significantly impact the total project delivery environment. So we put a 1 in there, and now we see the total risk impact for the project. This risk of inadequate training is being ranked as a medium possibility, a medium grade risk for our project. And that's simply the result of the addition of a 6 computed for cost, a 27 for time, a 5 for scope, and a 14 for quality. So taking all of those together, we add them together, and it's assessed to be a medium, and that's simply because the result is greater than 50 but less than 75. So having done the specific analysis of one risk, we need to put it into our risk register to ensure the risk doesn't get lost. So we again identify the risk, inadequate training, and we give it the probability impact of medium. At this point, as all we're doing is risk identification, we will not be filling in the risk management strategy, the dates, and the current status. They will be filled in later in the risk management process, which will be covered in a future nugget. In this nugget on risk identification, we focused on the process of identifying risks. We identified what risks are. Risks are unknown events, unplanned events that can have an impact on your project. Risks can have a negative impact on your project. Opportunities can have a positive impact on your project. So identified what risks are, the unknown events that can happen to impact your project success, and we talked about what risk management is all about, why it's important that we do risk management, why it's important that we put processes in place to minimize and mitigate the impact of risks on your project, to maximize and ensure that opportunities happen on your project, and the goal is to ensure your project delivers on time, and on budget. Although other aspects of project management have a bearing on delivering the project on time and on budget, possibly risk management and risk identification has the greatest impact on ensuring your project delivers on time and on budget because you're developing the contingency. You're putting the plans in place to deal with the uncertainty, to provide the extra cushion of time and money to put the plans and actions in place to eliminate the negative aspects on your project and to maximize the positive actions on your project towards successful project delivery. This concludes our nugget on project risk identification. I hope this video has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.